All right, let's dive right into this explainer. If you look around at the world order we live in today, you'll see it was completely forged in the fires of a single devastating conflict, World War II. It's wild to think about, but in just a few short years, the United States completely transformed. We're talking a shift from an isolated, depression-ridden country straight into a solitary global superpower, suddenly armed with the most fearsome technology ever created. It's a massive, complex story, but we're going to break the whole thing down. To help us navigate this, here's our roadmap. We're going to hit the global powder keg, how the sleeping giant awakened, the transformation on the home front, the brutal war on two fronts, the atomic end, and finally, how the post-war world was forged. Starting off with Part 1, the global powder keg and the descent into chaos. So, back in the 1930s, a global economic depression basically created this massive power vacuum, and the Axis powers capitalized on this hard, expanding their territories at a speed that was frankly terrifying. This descent into chaos actually started way before the United States even got involved. Take 1931, Japan invades Manchuria under a totally false pretext just to secure natural resources. Fast forward to 1937, and that escalates into a full-scale invasion of China, bringing with it some truly brutal atrocities. And meanwhile, over in Europe, Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany was busy throwing the Treaty of Versailles out the window, which eventually culminated in that lightning-fast blitzkrieg invasion of Poland in 1939. Now, what's really fascinating here is this stark contrast in global mindsets at the time. On one side, you've got these incredibly aggressive imperial ambitions. Germany is looking for Lebensraum, or living space in Eastern Europe, and Japan is pushing for a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. But then, on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you have the United States. After all the gut-wrenching carnage of World War I, Americans had retreated hard into isolationism. They wanted absolutely no part of the conflagrations burning through Europe and Asia. Which brings us to Part 2, the sleeping giant awakens, covering Pearl Harbor and mobilization. That deep-seated American isolationism? It was violently shattered in a single morning. Trying to cripple American naval power and secure their conquests in the Pacific, Japan launched a total surprise attack on the naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, December 7, 1941. The sheer shock of that event claimed 2,400 American lives and literally evaporated U.S. isolationism overnight. Congress declared war, and the sleeping giant was officially awake. But as we know, economies win wars just as much as militaries do. So to fight back against the Axis, the U.S. government practically drafted the entire economy into service. Wartime spending absolutely skyrocketed. To put this in perspective, in just 4 years, the government spent double the amount of all previous federal spending in U.S. history combined. It's staggering. This massive intervention virtually wiped out unemployment and completely pulled America out of the Great Depression. Moving on to Part 3, the home front transforms, where we'll look at labor, race, and injustice. All this economic boom led to some unprecedented social upheaval. With millions of men deployed overseas, factories were desperate for workers to fill vacant positions. This triggered a massive influx of women stepping into industrial labor, famously symbolized by the iconic Rosie the Riveter. And thanks in part to executive orders that banned some racial discrimination in defense industries, the proportion of black workers in these vital jobs actually tripled, jumping from 3% up to 9%. But minority workers wanted more than just defense jobs. They saw the glaring hypocrisies of fighting for freedom abroad while still facing brutal segregation at home. So the Pittsburgh Courier, which was a leading black newspaper, launched the Double V campaign. They were urging African Americans to fight 2 wars simultaneously. One for victory against Nazism and fascism overseas, and another for victory against racial inequality and segregation right at home. It was a powerful push for true, actualized democracy. Yet in a pretty staggering contradiction to those exact ideals, war hysteria and deeply rooted race prejudice led to one of the most egregious civil rights violations in American history. President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. Just imagine being stripped of your home, your job, and your freedom, and placed in an internment camp behind barbed wire simply because of your heritage. Over 110,000 people of Japanese descent were detained. And the truly staggering reality here is that 70,000 of them were American citizens, targeted not for any proven disloyalty, but literally just because of their ancestry. All right, let's turn to Part 4, War on Two Fronts, Europe and the Pacific. While the home front was totally transforming, millions of deployed American soldiers were facing two distinct, completely contrasting nightmares overseas. In the European theater, Americans were slogging through freezing winters, dense forests, and shattered urban centers, fighting this heavy mechanized war against German tanks and artillery. Meanwhile, over in the Pacific theater, the environment itself was essentially an enemy. Soldiers had to endure sweltering tropical jungles, monsoons, and diseases, all while executing grueling amphibious island-hopping campaigns against Japanese forces. And because surrender was often viewed as cowardice, it resulted in incredibly fanatical, to-the-death combat.
Now we really need to pause on this staggering number, 25 million. It perfectly anchors the immense scale and horror of the Eastern Front in Europe. While American and British forces pushed from the west, it was the Soviet Union, enduring a brutal scorched earth invasion and horrific starvation sieges that ultimately broke Hitler's army. To give you an idea of the scale, roughly 80% of all German casualties during the entire war happened on this devastating Eastern Front.
As the Allies finally pushed into Germany and Poland to liberate the continent, they uncovered the horrifying reality of the Holocaust. Industrialized death camps had been operating for years, resulting in the systematic murder of 11 million civilians, which included 6 million Jews. It exposed a deeply tragic failure. The international community, and yes, that includes the United States, had turned away refugees and failed to adequately respond to the early signs of this genocide.
This brings us to Part 5, the atomic end, and a devastating conclusion.
With Germany conquered and Hitler dead by May 1945, the U.S. pivoted its full attention to the Pacific. Military planners were terrified that a mainland invasion of Japan would cost up to 500,000 American casualties, not to mention countless Japanese lives. So, to avoid that invasion, they turned to a highly secret weapon developed under the Manhattan Project. After a successful test run in July 1945, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that August. The blasts instantly killed nearly 180,000 civilians and ultimately forced Japan's unconditional surrender. The director of the lab that designed the bomb, J. Robert Oppenheimer, later recalled this haunting line from Hindu scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." It's a quote that perfectly captures the grim realization of what had just happened. Sure, the war was won, but humanity had just crossed a massive threshold into a terrifying new atomic age, where total global annihilation was now mechanically possible. Finally, we arrive at Part 6, Forging a Post-War World, looking at the GI Bill and the new global order.
The war was over at last, and the United States was absolutely determined to ensure that the massive economic collapse and diplomatic failures that followed World War I would never, ever be repeated. On a global scale, leaders recognized that the old League of Nations had been a failure. The goal now was to create a truly robust international body. From the early vision of the Atlantic Charter in 1941 to the structural planning at Dumbarton Oaks, the whole effort culminated in June 1945 when 50 nations signed the United Nations Charter. The hope was to guarantee post-war global peace and security for good.
Back home, the focus shifted to the millions of returning veterans. Congress passed the GI Bill, which was honestly a monumental piece of legislation that essentially created the modern American middle class by fueling a massive housing and education boom. We're talking unemployment benefits, billions in college tuition, and zero-down home loans. However, it is incredibly important to point out that due to systemic segregation, redlining, and military quotas, these life-changing benefits were frequently denied to Black and female veterans. Which leads us to this final, really provocative thought to leave you with. The United States exited the crucible of World War II as an unrivaled global superpower with a booming economy. But it also carried a deep inherent paradox. Millions of marginalized Americans had literally fought and bled for global democracy, only to return to a nation that was still strictly enforcing segregation and injustice. These glaring contradictions, born right out of the war effort, would soon ignite the massive civil rights struggles of the next generation. So while the war settled the question of global fascism, it left America with some profound questions to answer about itself.